Amy is the award-winning author and has been called one of the best YA writers working today by New York Times Book Review. Some of her many acclaimed novels include Me and Marvin Gardens, The Year We Fell from Space, Please Ignore Vera Dietz, Ask the Passengers, Dig and Switch. In 2022, she received the Margaret A. Edwards Award for her lasting contribution for young adult literature. She is a faculty member of the Writing for Children and Young Adults MFA program at Vermont College of Fine Arts. And after many years of farming abroad, she now lives back in southeastern Pennsylvania with her family. In Attack of the Black Rectangles, Amy shows all the ways truth can be hard, but still worth fighting for. So without further ado, please help me in giving a very warm virtual welcome to Amy Sarig King. Take it away, Amy.
Thank you so much, Dana. I so appreciate that introduction. It's always still so weird to hear basically that I achieved my childhood dream. It sounds a strange thing to say. You'd think I would have noticed, but these are the sorts of things that sort of creep up on you. You're like, hey, I ended up an author. And so tonight, I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank RJ Julia. Listen, I am an independent bookstore fan from the beginning. I know if you're here, you support your indie bookstores, but I always like to put that out there, that to support bookstores is to support communities and to support real people who pay their taxes is kind of how I put it. And sometimes when I'm at my hometown indie, I go a little further and talk about blasting into space, but I'm not going to do that tonight, although that might be too late. What I do want to do is I want to read you a little bit from Attack of the Black Rectangles, and then I want to talk to you about where it came from, like where the idea came from and why. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about sort of, I don't know, some of the things I talk about when I go to schools and other places like that. And then we'll go from there and hopefully take some questions. I'm really into questions. I love questions. But first, I'm going to read you about 8 or 9 minutes from Attack of the Black Rectangles, starting with the prologue. And if we're ever lost for questions, ask me why I always put a prologue in my book, because there is an answer. Prologue, the adults around here. According to a lot of the adults in our town, everything here is perfect. We don't have accidents. We don't have any crime at all. We don't have Halloween anymore or junk food. We don't have bad thoughts. We don't use any bad words like cancer or death or sex or donut. A lot of people thank Ms. Laura Samuel Sett for this. She's as famous as a person can get in our town, and probably the only reason the local newspaper is still in print. Everyone reads her letters there. Ms. Sett is also a 6th grade teacher, but the adults around here are her students as much as kids like me who pass through her classroom at Independence North Elementary School. Those adults join Ms. Sett in letter writing, sitting on the town council and committees, and making rule after rule after rule. They seem to believe that rules equal safety. By making more rules, they are keeping us all safe and keeping the town's reputation spotless. Ms. Sett thinks that if we even think about bad things, our whole town could fall right into the toilet of the world. Just like all those other towns, she says. The adults around here don't just keep our town safe from unsavory words and thoughts, they keep our town safe from unsavory people too. And if we believe what the adults around here say, then unsavory people are anyone who doesn't go to church, anyone who doesn't pledge the flag louder than the person next to them, and anyone who eats junk food. Most of us have to go to the next town over to do our grocery shopping so we can buy Cheetos. My family has ignored the town's silly rules for as long as I can remember. We don't go to church. I don't pledge the flag overly loudly. And we eat a decent amount of junk food. My mom loves Oreos. I love Cheetos. And my granddad is a bona fide candy freak. Ms. Sett wrote a letter to the paper one time about an elderly man who sits on Main Street, always eating candy. She asked for him to be removed for his bad example to children. She was talking about Granddad. Here's what he did in response. He started bringing me with him. Don't get me wrong, we eat really good homemade food and lots of fruits and vegetables, and I get a lot of calcium and vitamins and grains and protein and all the other stuff in the food pyramid. There are much worse things in the world than junk food. Mom knows it because she works at a place that helps people grieve the death of their loved ones and helps people with cancer and other terminal illnesses. Granddad knows it because he fought in the Vietnam War. My dad sure knows it because he's always mad at something, like every single day. I just think Miss Set and the adults around here should mind their own business. I don't think any town is perfect, and I don't think any town is in the toilet of the world. I think life is what life is, and we just have to try our best. And for all I'm about to say here about her, and for all her weird rules, Ms. Set taught me to stand up for myself, and I'm grateful to her for that. You're probably confused. Yes, Ms. Set is a pain and thinks we shouldn't eat Cheetos, but also, yes, she was nice to me when I needed it most. No one is ever just one thing, and not everyone is telling the truth. That's the closest anyone will ever get to perfect. Chapter 1, last year, Bot Duck Man. We were on the way to Philadelphia with the 5th grade school trip when Dennis and I made up the game Bot Duck Man. It stands for botfly, duck, and human. Botfly on account of Dennis's uncle getting one in his arm the last time he went to Costa Rica. Duck because we live in a town with a lot of ducks, and ducks eat insects, including, we figured, botflies. Human on account of the way Dennis described the botfly coming out of his uncle's arm right by the elbow and how bad his uncle said it hurt. I am never going to Costa Rica. Anyway, it's just like rock, paper, scissors, and I highly recommend it as an alternative to listening to the tour guide at the Liberty Bell. Stop it. Those were the first 2 words I ever heard from Ms. Set. She was a chaperone because the school always had 6th grade teachers chaperone 5th grade trips. Stop it, she said again, and then she moved Dennis to the other side of the Liberty Bell so we couldn't finish our Bot Duck Man tournament. I was winning. Bot beats man, duck beats bot, man beats duck. After the Liberty Bell, we went to Independence Hall, where the tour guide was way more boring than the Liberty Bell tour guide. And no, I don't have a bad attitude. I've seen the Liberty Bell and Independence Hall 3 other times, and each time I wasn't impressed. It's not that I don't respect the founding fathers, but I do have some problems with how they did stuff. Mostly how they bought and sold people. I definitely have a problem with that. So when it was question time at the end of the tour, and we were standing right in the room where the founding fathers had signed the Declaration of Independence, I raised my hand and asked, how many of the guys who signed the Declaration of Independence own slaves? Miss Set moved quickly toward me with her hand out. The tour guide said 41 out of 56 signers own slaves. That's a great question. Thanks, I said. I'm white, so maybe this seems like a weird question, but just because I'm white doesn't mean I can't talk about what white people do wrong. We do a lot wrong. For starters, we don't talk about how 73% of the signers of the Declaration of Independence owned slaves. Miss Set stopped edging toward me once the tour guide answered, but she gave me a disapproving look while she listened to the next question. Marcy Thompson asked something about why women weren't invited to the whole signing party. Predictable. Marcy was always talking about women and how they need more rights. I've been stuck in the same class with her since 1st grade. The whole time I thought she was okay, as long as he didn't say anything to her. On the bus home from the Philadelphia trip, the teachers made us sing Row, Row, Row Your Boat like we were 1st graders. They made us do it in 3 different groups of singers so we could appreciate the harmonies. Dennis and I were playing our best out of 21 tournament of Bot Duck Man. He won both games during Row, Row, Row Your Boat because I can't sing and think at the same time. Then I lost my place in the song and sang out of sync with everyone until I just stopped singing altogether. Marcy Thompson leaned around the seat in front of us and chided, "You two should really pay more attention." "Are you a teacher now?" Dennis asked. "Trying to be a good friend," she said. Dennis looked like he was going to say something mean. So I said, "You're a great friend, Marcy, but you could probably be more chilled out." My mom taught me how to do that. Chapter 2, What Grace Is. My mom knows a lot about grace. As I said, she works in hospice care, which is technically where people who know they're going to die go so they can die in peace. Once people die, she then helps her loved ones through their grief. And if that isn't the most graceful thing I've ever heard of, I don't know what is. Another reason mom needs grace is her dad, my granddad. He lives in our basement in what he calls the old fogey flat. He says flat instead of apartment because he married Graham, who was from a place called Cornwall in England. He's American, 100%, but he adopted words from her like flat instead of apartment, bin instead of trash can, and a lot of other ones I can't remember unless he's using them. Granddad has his own kind of grace. It's loud. Loud grace looks like attending protests and writing letters to the president about veterans' benefits and civil rights. Sometimes he stands on the front porch and yells at anyone driving by our house at more than 25 miles per hour to slow down. An even bigger reason mom needs grace is my dad. He hasn't lived with us since I was 8, but he still comes around to work on Granddad's old car with me on Saturdays. This was how he and Mom arranged it when he moved into a place where he can't have me stay on weekends. He eats dinner with us on Saturday too, which can get tricky sometimes because he's hard to deal with. But Mom's grace is unconditional with mashed potatoes and gravy. Dad likes to tell me he isn't from Earth originally. He isn't even from our galaxy. And the car he's working on in the garage isn't really a car. It's a spacecraft. That's our secret. It's also one reason he can be so hard to deal with. I mean, it's difficult to get someone to follow Earth rules when they think they don't apply. He first told me about it a long time ago when I was too young to worry about why he was being so weird. He says he's some kind of alien anthropologist, a sort of scientist who studies other cultures. One time when I was 7, he yelled at all of us for not telling him that the neighbors got a rabbit hutch. Mom said to me after Dad stormed out to take a walk, "He's just upset he didn't know before us, that's all." I went to my room and tried to figure out the real reason why he was so mad about rabbits. I considered that maybe on his planet, rabbits might be venomous. I couldn't wait to ask him about it, but when he got home that night, he pretended that it never happened. So the rest of us pretended too. Being around people who pretend something didn't happen when it did happen requires grace. Accepting that Dad doesn't live with us anymore requires grace. Helping him work on Granddad's car every Saturday while he barely talks to me requires grace. Acting like this is all normal requires grace. Grace is a good thing to have. It's like jam. It sweetens things. So that's the end of the straight up reading from the book. But I do want to tell you kind of what happens next in a way, right? So now you've been introduced to the main characters, right? You've got Dennis and Marcy, who are Mac's friends, okay? And then you've got Dennis, and he's not sure if Marcy's his friend, but in fairness, she turns out to be quite a great third friend to that group, right? And we know about what's going on at home with Granddad and Mom and Dad, right? But I want to go back into the school setting. So we have this whole introduction about last year, and then we just enter into the summer where we find out that Dennis kind of has anxiety, especially about what teacher he's getting the next year. And I think that's pretty common. But he actually has legitimate anxiety about this. And so they get through the summer pretty well. And then they find out that indeed they have Laura Samuels set as their 6th grade teacher. And they were really scared because between her letters that are in the paper, which are very sort of strict and stern, and then there's also rumors, there's rumors about Ms. Set. In fact, one of my favorite ones, Dennis is a chronic sloucher, much like me, And so he had heard that she had this sort of plywood device that she would strap students into to correct their posture. And so he was, all freaked out about that. Anyway, the first day of school comes, and Miss Set kind of blows them all away by being really cool. And she kind of is like, hey, this is going to be like college. This is your last year here at the elementary school. You're in 6th grade. So I'm going to let you choose a lot of the things that you can do so that you can have choice and you can, really dig in on the topics that you want, which is a big deal for Mac, because much like me and a lot of other young people and older people that I know, he doesn't necessarily like spending time on things that he's not interested in, especially in school. And so he was like, this is going to, and she even said it's going to be like college. Like, you can choose your stuff. And basically, if you have a poor grade, that reflects, on you. And if you have a great grade, that reflects on you. And so by lunchtime on the first day of school, they're really, really excited about the fact that she might be a little cooler than she thought than they thought. And she does prove to be, she's a good teacher in so many ways. And then about 2 weeks into the school year, they see a bunch of boxes on her desk, and she had talked to them about literature circle and how they were going to read certain books, and they had to choose books on, a sheet. And it turned out that Mac and Dennis and Marcy all chose a book called The Devil's Arithmetic by Jane Yolen to read for their lit circle. And as well as 2 other students, Hannah and Aaron. And they all break up into their circle groups, and they get their copies of The Devil's Arithmetic. And they get then they have a flex kind of period at the end of the day where Dennis goes off to chess club and Marcy goes off to chorus, and Mac answers sort of some of the basic questions about the cover and sort of like the stuff it says on the front and on the back and stuff. Just to kind of get a get to know you worksheet when it comes to the book. Anyway, he goes home, and his dad is actually there working on the car. And so he's sort of distracted by that. He hears the phone ringing in the house, and he doesn't answer it. And dinner happens, so he's there now with mom and granddad. Dad's gone the other way. And mom says, oh, by the way, Marcy called. She left a voicemail, and she wants you to call her back and have your book in hand, So he does, and he calls her back, and he's like, what's up? And she said, hey, open your book to page 93. And so he does. And he finds words crossed out in there. And then she tells him to go to the next page, and he finds words crossed out there too. And she asks him, to read around, do you think, he's like, who would do this? First of all, who would do this? And I wonder what it is, because that's the first thing you think, I think, right? And she said, well, read the scene, that especially on that first page, read the scene. And he did. And it's a really, really hard. I mean, look, The Devil's Arithmetic is about the Holocaust. It's an incredible book. I really highly recommend it. And I hope you buy it if you haven't read it, and read it now. It's so good. But that scene on page 93 is really, really, it's not a difficult read, but of course it's a difficult read. Anything that involves a concentration camp, young people, and a shower, which is where that's set, is a really difficult read. It's certainly tough. And to find these words crossed out immediately makes these 3 kids curious. And so the rest of the book is about them finding out what the words are, and then trying to find out why they were crossed out, who crossed them out and why, what their reasoning was, and then trying to fight to get uncensored copies. This is actually my uncensored copy that my kid got when the exact same thing happened to him in his 5th grade class. I bought this at Aaron's Books in Lititz, Pennsylvania. And before I did, I took these 2 pictures of the censored copy. This is page 93, and that scene I just talked about, this is further on at 117. And I mean, when you see that, if you can imagine that this is an incredibly important scene, and especially the content of the scene, this is the Holocaust. Don't mess around inside of a paragraph about the Holocaust, especially that, when we get into what this word is, which I mean is kind of a spoiler in a way for the book. So I'm not going to mention it unless we get into questions and somebody really wants to know, then we can absolutely have the conversation. But I think the first thing that happens here is it distracts, right? It distracts you from what you're reading. And I don't know if that's the type of topic you want to distract on, But then the second thing that happened was the why. And I will tell you why. That I was told, and that I'll just say that's a word for a body part. It's an anatomical word, and not one that any fifth or sixth grader or second grader, for that matter, is unaware of. But to distract the scene because of that, the reasoning told to me at the school where my child was that they were afraid, the person who crossed out the words were afraid that the boys would giggle. And that really fell right into why I write for young people. I get questions a lot of times. Like, it's a fun being a writer for young people, because you'll find writers for adults will ask you questions like, when are you going to write a real book? And you can say, like, what do you mean? Like, they're like, for adults. And I'm like, oh, you clearly haven't read my work, one. But, but two, the idea that, I don't know, that adults have historically underestimated children, all of us. And when I say adults, I'm not pointing outward. I know I am one too. And we historically underestimate and kind of, we try and lift children up, but we also are limiting them a lot of times in our own ideas, right? Because I work with teenagers a lot of times, my number one thing that I like to talk to young people about is, hey, did you know that, like, the word teenager wasn't really in popular or really much usage at all until the 1950s, which is really not that long ago. It's 70 years ago, right? And why? And I like to ask the audience why, and they don't know. And so I say it's because they wanted to categorize you so they could sell you things that you don't need. And now that we have these magical little things, right? We've got social media that's also making us feel small. And there's no better way to sell somebody stuff they don't need than by making them feel small. And so I get into conversations with young people that are consistently so intelligent and so deep about things like that. I joke, I start out by saying, I went to Instagram this morning and it was overly concerned with my neck wrinkles. Today, I said that to a bunch of fourth graders, but I didn't say it that way. I said, Instagram seems to think I shouldn't have wrinkles, but I'm 52 years old and I should have wrinkles. And I think wrinkles are beautiful. And we're so often taught, to dislike ourselves in this world and to doubt ourselves. In fact, self-doubt, I think the quote I kept putting up on the screen today is, in a culture that profits off of self-doubt, it's a rebellious act to like yourself. And that is absolutely my message to young people, because we're constantly underestimating them. And when I see something like this, that to me is specific to boys. Why are we pampering them? Why are we thinking that is pampering? Why are we trying to save them from a word that we are the ones sexualizing in, they are not, these sorts of things. So it's been a really interesting conversation to have. When I think about censorship, I think about kind of the different kinds, okay? This is one kind. This is simply just crossing out words. But then I think about, like, banning of books on a larger level, which we're seeing right now. I mean, it's been cyclical. We always have had banned books week. Well, not always. That started a while ago, but we've always had people trying to shut out pieces of art. It doesn't necessarily mean writing too, but we're gonna concentrate on banned books because next week is banned books week. And when I get to talking about that, I get to talking about why I'm a writer, right? I'm a writer because I grew up in a I've set all my books in Pennsylvania. I love Pennsylvania. I just lived in Ireland for a long time. And when I moved back, where did I move back to? Pennsylvania. And yet it's still really, there are parts of Pennsylvania, including inside my hometown, that I'm not fully comfortable with. Because there are, racism is big there, and anti-Semitism is big there, in spots, in pockets. And I think one of the reasons, no, actually the biggest reason that I am a writer is because I was surrounded by things I didn't agree with. And so if we remove all the books that we don't agree with, then where do we get inspiration? Not just for living life or what we want to do with our lives, which is positive, inspiration, we'll say. But I also think that, I don't know, I suppose I wouldn't call it negative inspiration, but having to explore hate my whole life and trying to figure out why people do the restrictive things that they do, which is what I'm doing in this book, has been a real interesting journey. My mom had this great thing that she did when I was young, and she still reads the paper every single day, the newspaper. And so she'd be sitting there, and my mom was an educator. I was raised by, generations of educators. And she'd be sitting there with the paper, and she'd say, "Hey, come here." Like from the moment I could read, pretty much. And she'd pull me over to the newspaper and she'd say, "Read that," right? Whatever article it was. And I mean, it was always age appropriate. And I mean, she worked in special ed, so she really did understand. She was truly trained as an educator of what age appropriate meant. And I would read it, and she would say the most magical thing ever right after then. She would say, "What do you think about that?" And that's what she would say. And then I would answer. And you know what? I look back and I think, wow, you know what? There were a good few times when I read articles about certain things that when she asked me what I thought about that and I answered, I didn't necessarily say something that she'd agree with. And you know what? She never said a word. She just would go, "That's interesting. Okay, that's cool. All right, go clean your room," or whatever. And what's also interesting is that in teaching me critical thinking, which is exactly what that is, right? She and I ended up having the same kind of ideas about pretty much everything, even though she never taught me how to think, how to vote, anything like that. She and my dad always let me be a free thinker. And then you go into, well, okay, what gives you, what is research, right? When you're a writer, what is research when you're an artist even, right? I'm a visual artist first. And I think to myself, research is finding stuff that disgusts me. Here's a Kurt Vonnegut quote. It's one of my favorites, and I quote it at a lot of writing workshops that I run. "Where do I get my ideas from? You may as well have asked that of Beethoven. He was just goofing around in Germany, just like everybody else. And all of a sudden, this stuff came gushing out of him. It was music. I was just goofing around like everybody else in Indiana. And all of a sudden, this stuff came gushing out of me. It was disgust with civilization." Now, when I talk to young people, or actually it doesn't matter what age, but especially young people about that, I'm like, adults would tell you that's harsh, but there are things in this culture that disgust you. And that is absolutely, what a lot of books are made of, and I think it's super important that we get into the fact that if you start removing things that disgust you, then you're missing the point of critical thinking and why so many different types of books are out there. If I can't read the opposite of what I agree with, well, that's not much of an intellectual playground at all, And so when I think about, libraries are there to offer access to books to all sorts of people and all kinds of books. And to go back again now to the kind of the trend right now, there are a few things that are worrying me about it, and I'm going to share them with you. One, and this is actually reflected in my inbox too. This has been happening since I've been writing books. One is that a majority of the people trying to remove access to books for young people haven't read the actual books that they are trying to remove. First of all, in my inbox, people will actually say, "I haven't read your book, but this is what I thought, this is what I think of it," which is always an interesting and quite gutsy thing to say. But what we're seeing now is, this is a more organized group of people, which is, I love when people get organized. Like I try and stay, see both sides as much as I can, but they're working with lists that have been handed to them. And they are, majority have not read, obviously, all the books on the list. It's be very hard to find anyone who read all the titles on the list on, from say there's a place just across the river from me in Pennsylvania. It's called York, Pennsylvania, and Central York School District had one of the largest bands this time last year. And they pulled everything from early reader biographies of Sonia Sotomayor and also I think Martin Luther King, all the way up to, you know, some of the more books that you're seeing on the other lists too. But that particular list was shockingly targeting authors of color, books with characters of color, books where the reality of being a person of color in America in modern times is reflected, and also books that correctly recorded the history in America. That was disturbing to see, alongside of what still continues to disturb me, which is a sort of a hope to erase books and discussion around the LGBTQ community and members of it, and books reflecting that life, what a life is like that. And I think that's a wonderful thing to have in the world. You know, the idea, and I think the fear, and I had a fifth grader today say this to me, that, you know, the fear that a book like let's say with a gay character might mean that someone would turn gay. And this is what this young person said to me today. Well, that means all the gay people in the world would turn straight because those books, you know, how many books have we read with straight characters, you know? So it's kind of, you know, the reasoning behind it doesn't seem great, but what you realize when a bunch of people are trying to get something done, but they haven't read the books, that just means they're doing what they're told. And I would like to say that there are times and places for doing what you're told. For example, when you're in an assembly and there's a visiting author, you know, be quiet and, you know, raise your hand only at this point. Fair enough. But if you're doing what you're told when you're trying to limit young people, and that's what you're being told to do versus lifting them up and having a conversation. Conversation is two things, right? Communication is two things. It's not just talking. Communication is listening too. Right? So having a conversation is super important. And if there's a book that you don't like, oh my gosh, great. Read it and discuss it with someone who likes it, discuss it with someone else who doesn't like it. I mean, that's kind of how we form. That's why fiction is such a safe and comfortable place, right? For us to grow. It's one of the reasons I think, you know, we are formed by those early books that we read. We are. And I don't even think that that's necessarily just talking to today's readers. I think that's also just to people, because the people who don't read as adults, most of them still had some reading when they were kids. So yeah, you know, for me, I write books. I want to lift up young people. The idea of people doing what they're told is frightening to me. I will toss in something else I've added to this talk over the last week. I saw a stat the other day. My past, when I was in Ireland and then beyond that, I was a literacy teacher for a long time, which means I taught adults how to read. One of the first things I learned when doing this, although I never thought anybody to be, you know, like below me or dumb or anything like that, but I never expected literacy students to be as like completely out of this world intelligent. So many people kind of put down, I shouldn't say it that way, I actually said that all wrong, because I never thought anyone was not intelligent. But I think people often say, well, if someone's illiterate, and we'll use the word illiterate, which is really not a word that we use much in literacy. But if we use that word, we think it means that someone's uneducated. In actual fact, uneducated and smart are two very different things. And most of my students, first of all, had memories like steel traps. I mean, you try getting to 50 without knowing how to read. But one of the things that occurred to me recently is because I just saw, one of the things when I go into schools and when I talk to young people, I talk a lot about remember, please, to vote. And when you register to vote at 18, understand that that's how you can have more control over the things we're talking about, what's available in your library, things like this, and even what's available in your community and whom you're, you know, who really you're serving in your community. That's an important thing, right? But voting and voting in all elections, especially local elections, is important. But then this statistic came up, which was 54% of Americans read at or below a 6th grade level. Now, that could shock some people, or maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's a nice way to cynically kind of decide that the people you don't agree with, right, that maybe that's the reason. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to say this. I know literacy students and I know people who have mid-level skills very well. Those aren't the people who tend to walk over the literacy center threshold. Those tend to be people who are faking it, right? They're faking it to make it. They're trying really hard to be like, okay, I have confidence, but I know I can't spell a lot really well. And, or, still really kind of the confidence is kind of lower. And one of the things I learned when I was in Ireland and I was teaching was most of my students didn't vote. Well, of course they didn't. A ballot isn't a really intimidating thing, right? And so, and even to screen, like, what if I do it wrong, and they don't want to do it wrong. And so what I realized is that with our voting numbers in this country, a lot of our voting population that doesn't vote, perhaps many of them are just in a place where their confidence is low. And that's a really real concern of mine, because it's not that difficult to vote once you do it. You know what I mean? And so one of the messages I've been sending to audiences that I'm talking to is, listen, if you know some people who aren't voting, or even if you're on Facebook or Twitter, but Facebook especially, because that might connect you with your community, you can say, hey, I see you out there. I know you might be a little iffy on maybe your literacy skills. I don't judge. And come to me, talk to me. Let's get you registered to vote, and I can teach you how to vote. And I can't wait till you can do your civic duty this way. I can't wait to help you be able to do this, because it's part of using your voice, which is, again, what this book is all about. So I come back to the fact that these kids come back into their school. They come back into their school board meeting, and they absolutely talk about, hey, this is wrong. This is why it's wrong. And they have to deal with the red tape and how long it takes for school boards to make decisions and stuff. At the same time, Mac Delaney, the main character, is dealing with, well, what I already showed you, and I think you probably heard when we talked about the rabbits, a dad who's kind of difficult to deal with. But he's not really dealing with it. In fact, he's putting black rectangles over his feelings as much as someone put black rectangles over the words in his book. And what happens when you have a dad who doesn't really give you any good reason why he is the way he is, and instead sort of makes up stuff like the alien anthropologists kind of stories. And what happens, from what I can tell, is that you start to kind of gather a tumbleweed of shame. And I think that between being an adolescent, right, which already brings its own ridiculous amount of shame, because it just does. Our bodies change, our minds change, but then on top of it, the outside messaging, like people will say things about teenagers and roll their eyes, and it's scary, and growing up is scary. But on top of that, having somebody who continues to confuse you, and yet you share half your DNA with that person, that is a really proven type of problem for people in Mac's position. And I've known people with it. I've known people with that situation, and I've watched them struggle through it, and it's difficult. And I wanted to highlight it because I think it's also incredibly common. And it's one of the many things we don't talk about. A lot of the things that Mac is upset about in this book are things he calls that we kick into the long grass, the amount of, and I say it there in the opening, I kind of start as I mean to go on. I'm tired of people pretending things that are happening aren't happening. That's actually a form of what we call gaslighting. If somebody was to come up and smack you in the head, and then just pretend like they didn't smack you in the head, that would be, I would kind of follow you around, wouldn't it? Especially if they did it in public or if they did it regularly. And so adults do a lot of that to kids, not necessarily smacking them in the head, but a lot of adults will make a mistake and then pretend they didn't, or, that kind of thing. And you know what? I'm here to tell my adult listeners and readers, they see you and they know it's happening. There's no need to pretend. That's fine. They're fine, And yeah, they may make fun of you a little bit because of it, because they get to be the one that saw you make a mistake instead of the other way around. It's really time to start humbling. One of the biggest conversations I do have with teenagers, but especially this last year, has been about the fact that in their short lifetimes, they've never seen adults able to talk to each other about politics or really important rights, autonomy, all kinds of things. The conversations can't be had because no one's listening, or people are being rude, or just basically the conversation can't be had. When I try and talk to them about the times in the old days, it's almost like I'm talking to them about the times when the phone, was attached to the wall. But I'm telling them the time when politicians could meet in the aisle and work together, even if they were from two different parties. I talked to them about, my days, on, having a coffee with a senator who used to steal my parking space every Friday morning, who I voted for, even though he wasn't necessarily somebody that was from my party. He was good for my state, and he cared about my rights as a woman. And so, just trying to tell young people that there can be middle ground, though they're not seeing it much these days. So it's kind of an interesting balance, right? A little bit of compassion, a little bit of, hey, there's a gray area. Hey, we can find it. Well, at the same time, I'm telling you, censorship is wrong. And somebody may come up against me and say, well, actually, no, you know what? I agree with this censorship. And I'll say, that is your right to agree with it. But it's not your right to tell me what book I can read and what I will never try and tell you what book you can read or what you can't read. And I think that's one of the coolest conversations I've had over the last while. My friend Daniel Nayeri once said it's about concentric circles, and that very tightest circle is your house. You have control over that. You can control what happens in your house, absolutely. If in your house you don't want X, Y, or Z book read, that's no problem. But you can't tell your neighbors what they're allowed to read, and so on. The wider and wider that gets. And Daniel's from a country where, that's very different, than we are here. So he really understands that wider circle of censorship. So I could go on all night about all the different related topics, but I see Dana is back, and I'm wondering, hey, Dana, were there any questions in the box?
We do have some great questions here. Amy, you were talking a little bit about doing what you're told. So we have a question from Winsome, who says, we're seeing a lot of voices being silent. How would you encourage kids to approach the adults in their lives to start having this conversation?
Wonderful question. So I start with writing because that's how I did it. And I don't tell anybody else this one. So you guys are special up there at RJ Julia. I'm going to give you the skinny on this one. When I was a kid, I used to hang out in my closet inside my room. I got my own room because my sisters were closer in age and I was young and whatever, way younger. But in my closet is where I had it wasn't an imaginary friend because I didn't think he was real, but he was my vehicle to communicate with my mother about how I felt. He was a leprechaun, which kind of gets ironic considering I spent a lot of my time in Ireland, and because leprechauns are kind of low key racist in a way. So let's not racist, but I don't know what to call that. It's not appropriate really to get into leprechauns, but we won't go there right now. But he used to write my mom letters about how Amy felt in the third person, that Amy felt this and Amy felt that. And that was me. So, I was always writing my feelings. Now, if we get into how young people can help. All right. So remember I mentioned that Central York School District ban. It was the kids, it was the students in that school that overturned that ban. That was, like I said, that was an incredible list. And you can still find it on the internet. It is a shockingly racist and just wrong and sort of arbitrary list. It's very strange. Not to say, again, I don't like any of these lists, but this one was particularly disturbing. And it was, and you can find, if you search Central York School District on YouTube, even about banned books and the kids protesting, you can see some really great pictures and videos of those students from that school district. After all the other people fought back and couldn't get anywhere, it was the students who got somewhere. So what I would say to young people is, Really, y'all, your voice is so much more important. I know that, the world has felt like it's been trying to shut you up your whole life. Yep. I don't get it myself. I don't do that. But at the same time, yep, I understand. But now just open up your mouth, say stuff. So letter writing, go to my Instagram. I have a sample letter. You can copy it and paste it, write it to your school board if they're trying to censor books in your school, or if they're trying to ban books. And just, get out there in every way you can. Volunteering is a great way to start, because once you volunteer for one organization in the community, you will suddenly be connected to a lot of organizations in the community.
Yeah. What would you say that those letters from the leprechaun to your mom was the start of your writing career in some way?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely echoes. Or yeah, what I do now. Same as my journal writing, and there were a few weird early types of writing that I would do, and that would be one of them. Yeah, absolutely.
Winsome says he did donate to the cause. That's great.
Okay. Awesome.
A few questions ask about why you put prologues in your book.
Oh,
and one says, except for in Marvin Gardens, which begins, there were mosquitoes.
That's true. I think that was a prologue, but then I changed it. I don't have a copy in front of me right now, but yes, prologue. So there was this thing when I came back to America, I joined a writing group, which really helped form me, really helped me understand the publishing business and how to finally, because I collected over 15 years, I collected more than 500 rejection letters. I tried to get published for a really long time. It took me 8 novels, 15 years, whatever. And I found this really great crew of people. And if you've ever been on a writing group online, a writing forum, you'll know that about every 9 months or so, the question comes up about, should you call it a prologue or should you call it first chapter? And back when you're not published, you really believe, like deep down, like, oh man, this is make it or break it. In actual fact, if the work is knockout, the editor or agent is not going to care what you called it. And I mean, maybe some agents are out there going, it's a prologue, I'm not saying yes. But if the work knocks them out, they're going to say yes. And if they are like that, I'm not sure you want them to be your agent, but that's between me and the agents who just heard me say that. But anyway, but there was this guy, and he always came in and said, I don't read prologues. And the one time I was like, wait a second. I was like, because I was kind of new in the place. And I was like, hold on, you mean like a preface, right? You mean like an introduction, like a nonfiction book? And he's like, no, prologues and fiction. I don't read them. And I'm like, but you have to read them. It's the beginning of the book. No, the beginning of the book is chapter 1. And if people don't want to call it that, I'm not reading it. So I decided every single book, I would put a prologue in it. And it would be so important to read the prologue that if this guy read my book and skipped my prologue, he wouldn't understand the book. It basically means I write prologues because I'm terribly stubborn.
In that moment, you decided.
Yeah, I did. I did. Yeah, actually, my last book, Switch, has 2 prologues.
That's great.
Yeah.
Another question. Oh, why did you choose The Devil's Arithmetic to showcase versus another book? There were so many books that could have been chosen. I know this was your son's book that.
Yeah, I mean, this is, asker of that question, this is real. Like, this really happened to me. And this really was the copy that I had to buy for my child. So I chose The Devil's Arithmetic for that. I also chose it because I thought, and I don't know if I knew that then. So straight up, that's why I chose it. That's really my decision making. But now that I'm here on this side of it, I'm really glad I chose it because I knew this then too. It echoes a little bit of our conspiracy theory problem here in America. And we do have quite a conspiracy theory problem here. And so there's a part in the book where I mentioned where Aaron, that one other kid in their group, he tends to be more of a conspiracy theorist. He's a flat earther. He really believes the earth is flatter, or so he thinks at the moment. He's playing around with it, whatever, we'll see. But when Mac is thinking about it, he's a little bit afraid of reading this book, The Devil's Arithmetic, with Aaron, because he's afraid that Aaron's going to deny the Holocaust. And so for me, I thought it was actually a really great way to layer the types of things that I'm talking about, because censorship is a slippery slope, and so is propaganda, and so are conspiracy theories. And when we have all of this, I call it just like that sensationalism, it can really lead to a confusing place to grow up. And it can lead to a place where people can have the ideas that started me out writing, which are that kind of ignorant hate, based on really strange conspiracy theories and ideas that aren't based in reality. So I was glad that I picked it for that. But the honest to God reason is because I was writing from a true story that happened in life.
Was there anything in your original drafts that you ended up editing out of the book?
Oh, there's always so many words on the cutting room floor. But, I can't remember anything specifically because I mean, editing for me, revision is a constant. Revision's everything because I don't write with a plot. I mean, with this, you'd think I would know. I kind of knew a little bit what would happen kind of at the end, but I didn't know even Granddad was going to end up being such a cool character. There was a lot of things I didn't know. I didn't know what Mom did for a living until I wrote that prologue, wrote those first, chapters. It was like, I wonder how this is going to work. I write by the seat of my pants. I always have. So
You're a pantser.
Yeah, I'm a pantser. Yeah, absolutely. And it's frustrating and fascinating all at the same time. It's terrible and terrific.
Another question, you were talking about how most people read, or I forget what the percentage of people read at a 6th grade level or
54,
less than.
4%.
What is interesting is that needle is not moving. How can we encourage more students to read?
Yeah, one of my biggest things as a literacy teacher, having been with very basic literacy in places where there was, severe poverty or severe abuse in schools, which is the two spaces I worked in, Ireland and Jamaica, I would say that here we tend to get real comfortable, right? Because we can get anything we want. We don't necessarily need to read at a certain level to go and order whatever we want anywhere, on the internet or whatever. But teen literacy is one of my passions. And the reason is because a lot of my students who had limited skills, and I think this is an important thing, because we think about literacy, we think about someone who can't read at all. And then we think of people who read a lot. And most people fit right in between, And in literacy in the literacy world, what we call limited skills, and people who believe they have limited skills. And I think that's where I find that confidence gap. And usually it's just and honestly, it kind of mimics the way that we psychologically kind of make when we're making a bully character. It's similar, where somebody who feels small because of fill in the blank, and let's say it's literacy skills now, then becomes a loud person with a bullhorn at a school board meeting who hasn't read the book, but is doing what they're told by trying to get it off of the library shelves. And that kind of, connects. So sorry, that wasn't your question. How do we get more young people reading? I have no idea. If I had the magic answer to that one, I would have a magic answer. We model it though. The number one way to get young people reading is to model it. So you know what I do? I sit around with this thing all the time doing this. And guess what my kid does? He sits around doing this. When I put this thing down and I read, guess what he does? He puts his down and reads. And now maybe it's fan fiction because he wants to really drive me crazy. And that's okay. I'm proud that I have raised a rebel like his mother. But we have to model it. We got to put those things down. We got to turn off the TV and sit down and read again, So I think that's it at best for the moment anyway.
Joanne would like to know, can you speak a little bit about the concept of grace and why it isn't so important to you and to Mac?
Well, I think that goes back to, grace is really important in every aspect of life, right? Like when I really think about day to day, I could be angry at everything all the time. I could be frustrated by everything all the time. There are people who live their lives like that. I know a few, and it's exhausting. Whereas grace always gives me this kind of energy. And I think that's good. I think that's the kind of energy we need to inject into our culture at the moment. Again, we're not talking well. We're not communicating. Plenty of people are talking, but we're not communicating, and we're not able to agree on things, even things that we agree on. Like, we're looking at here's a phenomenon I don't understand. When you've got, well, 85% of this person's constituents, right, the people who live in whatever state, believe in this, but that guy does the exact opposite of what those 85% do, and they still vote for him. That's people doing what they're told again. And I don't like that. And I mean that I don't care how you vote. I don't do that. I don't want anybody to do that. I want people to vote for people that do the right thing for them, right? So grace is where we start to give ourselves some grace, and we start to actually care about ourselves enough to vote for people that represent us. And so when I think back, I love to be able, like, people now really, they only vote. Let's just use the colors. I don't want to get political, but at the same time, I don't care. It's not a secret, right? So people who might only vote red are like, that's all I can vote. And I like to be able to say, actually, I used to vote for a Republican for years, and it was Arlen Specter, but he was a pro-choice Republican. Find me one of those right now. You can't. And that was grace. In that aisle where those political, adversaries could meet, there was grace in that aisle. But I think, honestly, in this world, we are so inundated with negativity, competition, nastiness. I don't know what else to call it, that it's time to inject it with some grace and some compassion. We're living in a world now, and I work with teens, and I love teens very much, but we're living in a world where the number one disease killing school-age children is mental illness. And I mean killing them, age 10 to 24. We need to have some change. And I believe that grace is a first step to model it and to make sure we give it to young people, to equip them with it, and then hopefully to change our world so that the people who would look at that stat that I just gave you and go, oh, well, that's probably their parents, or, oh, well, it's probably because they eat too much blah, or they play too many videos, like all that talking with not a lot of thinking. We need to try and go, no, actually, up with the critical thinking, down with the talking without thinking, and somehow model it. And so I think that grace is a first step to forgive ourselves for years of being judgmental and move into a place where we're not anymore.
That's beautiful. I know we're already at time, but I'd like to leave our listeners with one more question for you. Once they have Attack of the Black Rectangles and they read it, what do you hope that they're able to take from it? What is your greatest hope for this book?
Conversation. My greatest hope for every book is conversation. I don't care if they have it with their friends, their teacher, their mom, their dad, I don't care, neighbor, that'd be great. If they want to have a conversation with their school board because their school board's trying to pull other books, then have a conversation with them. There's a place for you to do that. When I'm asked what do I hope people pull out of a book or what they get from a book, I always say what they need. I didn't know that what I needed when I opened up the book that changed my life when in 8th grade. I didn't know, and I still can't quite put my finger on what it was, right, about that book. But what I found out, it's called Confessions of a Teenage Baboon by Paul Zindel. Okay. It changed my life. I mean, all Zindel's work did, but that book for some reason just punched me right in the face. And I think it was because, and I think it's the reason I ended up being such a Vonnegut, lover in my adult life too, is both Zindel and Vonnegut are unapologetically and unflinchingly honest. And I am absolutely, that's my bar. And so I want to meet it. And so one of the things I find is a real balm to young people when they're reading books is an adult being honest with them. Nobody's trying to sell them something. Nobody's trying to convince them of something. it's just that massive honesty, especially about the inner workings, you know what I mean, of the complicated life that adolescents are living. And so I guess that's what I hope they take out of this, is that honesty, which, you know, which I don't know, it's in all of us, but I think that we've been conditioned to be afraid, the same as people are afraid of books. So we come right back to that, you know?
Right back.
Right. So yeah, I hope they get what they need, but I hope that they see honesty and are reminded that it's raucous, to be honest. It freaks some people out, no doubt. Like, but it's
But
really,
we need it.
yeah, it's quite rad. It's quite rad, to be honest.
Well, thank you. Thank you for being with us, but thank you for writing the way that you do and bringing us the stories that you do and the honesty that you do. It's crucial and it's important and it's beautiful. And you all, if you've not gotten this book yet, you need to go out, you need to get it, you need to visit us in store or online and purchase it and add it to your to be read stack, because it's to be devoured. Attack of the Black Rectangles, it's out now, available for purchase. And Amy, we wish you the best on the rest of your book tour, and we can't wait to see what comes next from you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your time, and go and be awesome.
Go and be awesome. Have a great night. Thank you all for being with us.